Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to IAS Thursdays. We're pleased to welcome esteemed poet and critic Stephaine Burt today. My name is Bianca Castellanos, and I'm the director of the Institute for Advanced Study. We will do our best to offer descriptions of what we see on stage and on your screen today. And so that includes me. I am a brown-skinned woman with dark hair, wearing glasses, and with black frames. IAS Thursdays is a regular event series that brings a wide range of ideas, conversations, and viewpoints to the University of Minnesota and to our communities. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that I am speaking from the ancestral and contemporary lands of Dakota people. Land acknowledgements are just a beginning for respectfully recognizing Dakota people's history on this land and their sovereignty. And so in that regard, the IAS is actively revising our statement to concretely outline our commitment to working with tribal nations to affirm tribal sovereignty, reckon with this painful past, and counter historical and contemporary injustices. Our commitments at the IAS include advocating for racial justice, strengthening the work that we do with the communities around us, and creating pathways for institutional transformation with the aim of building an anti-racist, anti-colonial, and inclusive university that disavows white supremacy and racism. Before we begin, I'd like to make a few brief announcements. If you want to hear poems about mermaids and superheroes and trans joy, join the English department and Stephaine Burt for a poetry reading tonight at 7 p.m. in Pillsbury Hall, which is just next door. We hope you will join us next week for our 4th Spotlight series, exploring the theme of human in the data. And this event will feature a long-time collaboration forged right here at the IAS between Carl Flink, professor of dance, and David Odie, professor of engineering and medicine, and their work developing body storming, a movement-based modeling system using choreographic concepts that brings humanity into cancer research. And we can't wait to share this event with you. All those attending in person and also virtually online will have the opportunity to participate in a body storming practice. And this should be a lot of fun, so I hope you do join us. I would also like to remind you that everyone at all IAS Thursdays, including this one, include professional captioning. We recommend that online attendees view captions by clicking the stream text link shared via the chat or scan the QR code on screen. We will have a microphone for audience members, and we will also be using Slido to facilitate our Q&A today. You can use your smartphone to scan the QR code displayed on screen or go to www.slido.com and enter the code IAS Thursdays to submit your questions. We are also grateful to our partners in the English department, the program in creative writing, and the Edelstein-Keller Visiting Writer Series for making today's event possible. And now, if you will please help me in welcoming Peter Campion, Professor and Interim Director of Creative Writing.
Thanks. Hi, my name is Peter Campion. I teach. Hi, Steph. It's so good to see you. Welcome back to the Twin Cities.
I love it here.
I know you do. Steph used to teach at a small college nearby that you might have heard of called McAllister. And is published by Grey Wolf, is one of the other institutions around here we're really proud of. So I teach poetry here at UMN, and it's my pleasure to introduce Stephaine Burt. I'd like to thank the IAS as well as everyone who worked so hard to bring this event to life, including but not limited to Peter Mason and Terry Sutton. Thank you. I'm going to keep my introduction brief because I've been reading Steph's astute, insightful, imaginative, and generous criticism for almost a quarter century. So as you might guess, I'm really excited to hear this new talk. Steph will also be reading her own poetry tonight, as was mentioned. I'll mention it again, including work from this marvelous new collection, We Are Mermaids. And that's 7 p.m., 412 Pillsbury, as you said, right next door. It's free and open to the public, and I hope to see many of you there. Stephaine is a poet, critic, and a professor of English at Harvard University. Her critical books include Don't Read Poetry and the essay collection Close Calls with Nonsense, which was a finalist for the National Book Critics Circle Award. Her work has appeared in such publications as The New Yorker, London Review of Books, The Atlantic, New York Times Book Review, and many others. She's the recipient of many prizes and honors, including the Guggenheim Fellowship. It's hard to draw a line between the poet and the critic in Steph's case because her prose is so artful and her poems allow for such passionate intellectual investigation. In fact, considering Steph as a scholar and critic, I thought of telling you how impressed I was and still am by her first critical book, Randall Jarrell and His Age, 2005. Or maybe I would discuss Don't Read Poetry from 2019 with its snappy and very smart title. Or I was going to mention some of the poets to whom I was introduced by Steph's criticism, poets such as Laura Kosciuszki, Susan Wheeler, and Angie Estes. But it's a point that Stephaine makes in a recent piece about her own poems, which sticks with me most. I have in mind an essay called Reading Callimachus Through Comics that accompanies her 2020 collection, After Callimachus. You can find this essay through Princeton University Press online. Describing Callimachus, the Alexandrian Greek poet from the 3rd century BCE, whose poems Stephaine freely and brilliantly reinterprets in that book, she writes, Callimachus embraced the minor, the small scale, the whimsical, even the childish, or the sort of thing small-minded adults believe only suits children. If you don't hear a parallel to comics in that sentence, please read it again. He wrote about sexual desolation, but also about eros as a kind of play, akin to other play, to writing poetry, and to children's games. Callimachus sought intimacy, an art form capable of portraying small rooms and small problems, and an art form that could focus on the domestic and the miniature, Rhea nursing, Artemis cavorting, even when depicting the great and the gods. While Steph describes Callimachus with a kind of attuned, observant selflessness, nevertheless, she identifies what I most love about her own work. I mean, her profound knowledge of the classical idea of multum in parvo, a lot in a little, aka Mies van der Rohe's mantra, less is more. In her work, by delving into the everyday, the playful, the childlike and adolescent, even the awkward, the miniature, the nearly forgotten artifacts of pop culture. What was that album from 1992? And of course, those intimate small moments that make life worth it. Steph has achieved something very big indeed. In fact, I'm not even sure if this room will be able to contain it. But it does seem that, at least for now, this room contains the writer to whom I'm honored to give way, Stephaine Burt.
Oh, thank you. Peter Campion, thank you. Peter Mason, thank you. Everyone who's helped bring me here, thank you. And yes, this is ancestral Dakota land, and I don't know that I have much to add to that land acknowledgement, but it is important to make it. And Peter Campion, two things after that startling introduction, which I hope I live up to today and tonight. One is that the introduction to After Callimachus was co-written by myself and Mark Payne, the Chicago Classics and Complet professor who you may have worked with in other capacities, who I recommend all of Mark's work. And without him, the Callimachus book would not have happened. And the other is that the 1992 album is, of course, Les Jardins du Heavenly, the second Heavenly album. Do you know that one? You do, yeah. Yeah, it's Les Jardins du Heavenly. They're performing again, by the way. Are you on Instagram? No. You can follow the official Heavenly account. So good. Anyway, hi. So thank you for being here. If I'm going too fast or too slow or anything, feel free to interrupt me. This is a really good size for a substantial discussion. I feel loved and heard, and also it's interruptible, this, couple dozen people kind of room. And thank you to everyone out there online listening. I gather this is being live streamed. A little bit taller than whoever set up the mic. We're good? Yeah, hi. So tonight I will read some poems, and today I've been asked to talk about shipping containers, and I think this is the last stop for this talk before I send it out and let it get accepted or dinged by the editors of esteemed interdisciplinary scholarly publications. So if you catch any mistakes, please stop me. On March, hi. Oh, wow, this is extremely meta. How do I get the slides up there? There we go. Ooh, they're kind of blurry. Is that just, that's life? Here. Still blurry. Doesn't matter. Are we good? Anyway, on March 23rd of 2021, much of the globe's trade came to a halt. The cargo vessel and container ship, the Ever Given, wedged, as you may remember, in the Suez Canal, and the ship blocked the canal for 6 days. Normally 50 ships pass through it every day, and they're big ships because they are mostly container ships. They hold the boxcar-shaped objects that can hold themselves almost anything and bring it almost anywhere on a ship or a truck or a train. And the Ever Given blockage brought home how much the modern world depends on containers, which have streamlined, standardized, supersized, and accelerated global trade since the 1960s. And if you're not familiar with them, they look like that. You've seen them. They're made of standardized metal. They look like boxcars, and they are easy to fill with things and load on ships. Defenders of containers emphasize their utility in getting people, especially people in rich countries, things we might want or need. Other observers emphasize their destructive consequences for unions and for sailors and for workers and for seafloors. Containers and their cargo texture, a word I love, flesh out the profound structural changes of the 1970s, 80s, and 90s across the modern world, as Craig Martin writes in his recent book about them. The first true container ship made its first trip in 1956. Containers caught on in a big way a decade later. Mark Levinson follows earlier chroniclers in tracing the container to Malcolm McLean, who owned a North Carolina trucking company. And according to Levinson, 300 million 20-foot containers cross the world's oceans each year, and many of them then travel further via lakes and roads and rail. And this single container, which could travel from truck to train to boat to destination, in the novelist John Lanchester's recent phrase, made to a uniform scale, has become the definitive example of modern capitalism. That's Lanchester. And the filmmaker Alan Sekula, who you may have encountered, he's got an academic following, objects that the steel box that changed the world trading system creates disorder and throws the world out of balance, encouraging needless consumption and burning high-carbon fuels. And they're all correct. Containers do all these things, and I'm not here to defend their dominance, nor do I want to argue that we can or should get rid of them right away, any more than I want to defend or to abolish tomorrow railroads or automobiles or money. Instead, I want to do what other critics have done for railroads and automobiles and money, which shaped the built environments of rich countries and transformed their literature. Some poets, especially outside the US, but in English, have made modern shipping containers into distinctively contemporary metaphors. And these metaphors, along with the container's concrete and visible uses, add up to an argument about poetry and about the kind of poems we call lyric. How they work, what they do, and how they give some of us unlikely and portable spaces in which to imagine and share our own contemporary changeable lives. Now, the most important thing about a shipping container for an economist, like Levinson, might be its efficiency and its scale. But the most important thing about it for an architect or an urban planner, or a visual artist, or a literary writer might be its versatility. It lends itself almost uniquely among modern structures to international reuse. The Boston Globe reports that in New England, old shipping containers are being customized to take advantage of their cool factor. The German scholar Alexander Klose has photographed shipping containers repurposed as schools and first aid centers. They make fine temporary housing in Australian disasters and inadequate British council flats. The former governor of Arizona failed to make them into a border wall. The Memphis pub Rail Garden built out of containers is more successful with them, offering live music, secret spaces, surprises, and games. That's from their promo material. The California scholar Sarah Hirsch has studied Mexican-American vendors who live in containers and a collective that turns them into installation art. Hirsch writes that the container evokes what many critics call the post-West, defined not by the locality but by globalization's flows, and there's some more globalization flowing. But for the apotheosis of shipping container remaking and reuse, we can look at Aotearoa, New Zealand. In central Auckland, near the docks, a shipping container serves as a children's playhouse and free library. One side, propped open, serves as a porch, giving shade. Retail space just a few blocks away has restrooms, shops, offices in multicolored containers stacked 4 high. One holds toilets, another a bicycle pump. There you go. Wellington's own waterfront pedestrian mall has a shipping container sauna. If Wellington wanted them, the New Zealand city of Christchurch needed them. The second largest city in Aotearoa was practically leveled by earthquakes, as you may know, in 2010 and 2011. 6 years later, when I took most of these photographs, the city remained full of open space where demolished buildings stood, half-built replacements, and derelict, cracked, or unsafe structures, including its once iconic cathedral. It also exhibited marvelous container-based rebuilding. There was the Restart Mall, several blocks of retail and casual dining and even like consumer banking made entirely from containers like this, and here's some more. Outside the mall was the food container gourmet hub, pretty self-explanatory, with a skylight, and the self-descriptive coffee container. And outside the city, containers made improvised retaining wall and anti-erosion barriers, stacked too deep to shore up a crumbling hill. Some of these containers were clearly repainted and altered. Some just looked dropped in place. They entered the world with one purpose, and now they served others. Now, I can report that 5 years later, most of this container construction in Christchurch is now gone. They've built with other structures. The Wellington waterfront, however, now has a festival using iconic shipping containers for experimental and performance art, and that's been going for 12 years. That's called the Performance Arcade. Containers can move almost anything around the world, and they can seem interchangeable if we look only at their external forms, never at what's inside. But once we open them up, their contents bespeak varied uses and aesthetics, along with local or national customization. We can assemble, disassemble, resituate, and repurpose them, or alter the outside shapes and labels for the sake of what's new or desirable inside. Now, those last few sentences could describe shipping containers. I think they do. They could also describe the work of lyric poetry, whose recognizable, replicable forms, like the sonnet and the quatrain and the line itself, move sensibilities and personae and imagined subjects around the globe as well as through time. And as with shipping containers, we may view modern lyric poems as opaque or even self-concealing, or we may know what they hold and open them up. Like the container, the modern verse lyric may be repurposed almost infinitely in sequences or on its own, and there may be a person alive inside. Now, a lot of contemporary poets, it turns out, respond directly to the container industry. You find this once you start looking because the ones who are nationally prominent are not from the US, but there are US poets who do it. Amanda Nadelberg's 11-page associative poem, Matson, takes its name from the Bay Area shipping company that was the Pepsi to Malcolm McLean's Coke. The same poem takes its stack-like form, as Nadelberg has explained, from the container she saw in her Bay Area commute. Andre Serpa's book-length elegy, The Vault, compares a shipping container, an animal cage, and a bare room in which the poet considers his father's death. The room walked away, the way a wolf gets its sea legs in a shipping container. Everything not had, then had. And that's Serpa. The Canadian poet Kate Hall, in her poem, The Shipping Container, likens the container to a love letter and both to love poems, ineffective in the way that all lyric is, quote, ineffective. It does not literally make the absent beloved present, for example, nor does it remedy unrequited love or grief, but it circulates signs of absence in a system that bears its own compensations. I'm going to say that again. It circulates signs of absence in a system that bears its own ironic compensations. And I'll start reading Hall's poem. There must be a method of transport because there are regulations about the movement of dangerous goods. You made me a photocopy. Hall, by the way, is well known in Canada, as it happens, though not yet here. The collection containing this poem was a finalist for the Griffin Prize, which is a very big deal there. The poet, lawyer, and political gadfly Seth Abramson entitles a poem, Why I Decided to Become a Shipping Container. You've dealt with Seth Abramson. Yeah, I'm sorry. He writes, if you want to live inside me, good insulation and ventilation is a must. The real bonus to a shipping container is the new green phrase, adaptive reuse. Other poets take figures of reuse more seriously, like the El Paso-based Colombian writer Andrea Cotbotero, who in Olivia Lott's translation from Spanish describes containers as post-apocalyptic horns that bite at the ports, sheds smelling of imaginary bread, 800 million eggshells and vessels asleep in the middle of vessels. They are alive inside for Botero. They provide, as Wordsworth put it, life and food for future years. In Wayne Miller's poem, The American Middle Class, containers signify the turning of old things from ontic objects for use into ontological symbols, like Miller's own old barn. The boards, I'll read you some Miller, went to Barnwood Recycling, who sold the lumber to Rhino Development for $5.75 a board foot. Clearly, the barn was not a metaphor. It became the grade interiors of 3 restaurants, 2 of them made from shipping containers. Now, containers can also point to our place in a larger world system. And we'll get the world system back. Come on, world system. There we go. Lauren Macios, who is well positioned to see how poetry circulates globally, since her day job is at the Poetry Society of America, has a prose poem, a lovely one, called Now You Too Can Live in Your Very Own Shipping Container. And in it, everything has been canned, so to speak. And Macios goes on, at least we'll know the cans a little more intimately. Every commodity has stacked inside the primary colored container, stacked upon container. There is hardly a simile for it, so big we live inside pieces of it. That's Lauren Macios, a prose poem. For Macios, containers confine us, and their networks even represent what the scholar Timothy Morton calls a hyperobject, something too large and abstract and powerful for us to comprehend, like climate change or global trade. At the same time, the repurposed container gives Macios a figure for interiority, personality, intimacy. One more American example. Containers stand for poems and for stories as a kind of ironic refuge from those systems. In Barbara Fisher's, B.K. Fisher's novel and verse, Civ, which I really recommend very strongly. In Civ, the massive red hull of a container ship serves as a new ark, carrying its limited crew of families to refuge on a flooded, near-future Earth. Your bunk is in Roy's container, Bay 4, Tier 2, Row 17, our narrator Val tells herself. Containers keep their shape but change their purpose after the modern world system has collapsed. The wind and watertight objects that once held 12 Euro pallets or 400 flat screens now shelter the 67 souls on board this ark. And this ship, once a post-Panamax, Fisher's phrase, participant in the global economy, has become something like a floating sonnet sequence. A set of identically shaped containers, each one with an individual soul. And once the ark lands, Fisher writes, when the dove doesn't come back, the containers will be moved to a hillside, windows will be cut, closed cell soy foam insulation, and eventually windmills. They are nearly indestructible, her captain says, resistant to mold, termites, fire. The promise of lyric, a recognizable container for otherwise imperiled individual souls, becomes, in the words of Val's captain, also the utopian promise that someday we will recognize each other and the structures that hold us will no longer hide or confine. And you may be thinking of T.S. Eliot there, his lines about people in prisons. We'll get back to prisons in a minute. You can find more containers per poem and per acre, of course, in New Zealand. I'll read you the end of the poem Malady by Hindemana Baker. My mother remembers the rash that raged across her back and the fleshy heels of her palms. It vanished the day she said those words under her breath while stacking kindling in the shipping container we used for a woodshed we left 2 weeks later. The mother's words might have been, I want a divorce, but they might start with no. They might be a kind of spell, and the shipping container used as a garden shed, which is very common in Aotearoa, matches the juicer, also repurposed or reused. There's a carrot juicer later in the poem. The juicer reused as a means of expression, the screaming juicer that she pulverizes, as if to scream about what's happening to her parents. Now, another poet of Aotearoa, who is famous there and should be famous here, but Americans are really provincial, so who knows, has made a meditation on shipping containers the title sonnet for her 2017 volume, The Internet of Things. I love the aesthetic of working ports, rust, and containers, the way unwieldy ships move across the water like buildings trained in deportment. And, Camp goes on, we need to accept that the world is more intelligent than we are. Like leaves on a tree, we are something amazing that behaves in predictable ways. That's Kate Camp. Like leaves on a tree, we are parts of a system. We and our poems circulate with our similar shapes and bodies, and we might or might not learn a kind of humility once we see ourselves inside a hyper-object. Camp's ingenuous approach to language, her apparent humility, as with many other Aotearoa New Zealand poets of her generation, especially Pākehā poets. Pākehā is the closest to white in New Zealand English. It's not quite the same. Her approach, her low-key writing, becomes a potentially national characteristic. New Zealand poets eschew prophecy and arrogance. It becomes a sign we can trust her. She's inviting us into her, as it were, container. The Auckland-based poet Michelle Leggett, who I really recommend, I think people around here should know about her. She's got a Selected from Wesleyan Press now, please buy it. Michelle Leggett situates shipping containers in a more complicated national landscape. She remembers or repurposes the story she heard from another New Zealand poet, David Eggleton, about his night contemplating container port cranes. He knew what to do. I lie on my back against the lip of the crater to gaze up like an anti-gravity bungee jumper at the Star Trek of Spaceship Earth. Spaceship Earth here is itself a kind of repurposed or renamed container for people, and so is the poem, which also contains Eggleton. And so is Auckland, since the center city and some of its suburbs sit within the cones of extinct volcanoes. Takarunga, which is also called Mount Victoria, is a hill with a view in a harborside suburb, the one where Lord grew up, if you're keeping track. These two, Leggett writes, are part of the navigation. And again, these aren't household names here, but they're very famous in Aotearoa. Michelle Leggett and Dave Eggleton have both served as National Poet Laureate. Now, to be sure, poets likened, the poets are world famous in New Zealand. Poets likened international cargo to poems before the container era. C.P. Cavafy, for example. Any Cavafy fans here? Okay, great, someone, great. Hi, yeah, you, yeah. Let us be pleased when the ships enter the harbor. Some of the merchandise gets through in mislabeled boxes that say one thing on the outside and contain something else. That's Edmund Keeley and Dimitri Gondika's translation of Cavafy. John Masefield's once very famous poem Cargoes contrasted the glamorous cargo of Nineveh and distant Ophir with the drab industrial freight of British modernity. And Paul Muldoon made that poem a point of reference, or really a running joke, in his own 1980s volume, Quoth. But shipping containers as we now know them, I think, do more to help us think about poetry and poetics than Cavafy or Masefield can. Containers on container ships in the container system, repurposable, reusable, or stackable, rearrangeable rectangles with interiority. Sometimes we can know what's inside and sometimes we can't. The same can be said, as one critic writes, about the sonnet with its brief closed form and its intricate patterns that might be said to epitomize the repetitive qualities at work in every lyric poem. The critic Al Philrice quotes one of William Carlos Williams's famous attacks on sonnets. Forcing 20th century America into a sonnet, Williams complained, is like putting a crab in a square box. Then Philrice quotes Bernadette Mayer's advice that open-minded poets should write not single box-like sonnets, but sequences. Now, the sonnet itself, as some of you know, began in Sicily and traveled to Moscow, to Durban, to Dunedin. It began as a vehicle for love poems, it became a way to tell all kinds of stories, and it stands out in European literary history as one of the earliest lyric forms meant primarily to be written down and transported on paper instead of being song lyrics. Sonnets also move between world systems, nations, and languages, keeping their contents in one sense intact. And they move among venues from anthology to diary to book. In a process analogous to, and this is a technical term, containers' intermodal door-to-door delivery. They come from one site, but they don't stay put. They were invented in one place, used in another. They come in sets or sequences or stacks, but not always. They can be customized almost indefinitely by their later users. And they are, for better or worse, both obviously human-made and inevitably, if they work, mysterious. Catherine Schultz, the New Yorker writer, who has studied containers lost at sea, concludes that for an object that is fundamentally a box designed for things inside it, the container is a remarkable lesson in the uncontainable nature of modern life. And you could extend this analogy if you want beyond the sonnet. Alice Fulton, quoting Emily Roscoe, says that the poetic line itself functions as a means shaped by its container. And the Canadian critic Michael Lister remarks that when poems succeed, it's because their containers are constructed out of the materials of their contents. This notion of lyric as traveling container of poems and feelings and persons reflects back on other more ominous containers that some of you may have in mind. Are there Monica Youn fans here? People reading the poetry of Monica Youn? What? Anyone? Yeah? Just Peter? Jeez, okay. Are there people here who do Asian American studies? Or follow it? Or anything? Okay, I think I'm going to skip a section that has to do with containers and Asianness until we've got some Monica Youn fans here. No, you know what? There might be some online. You should know about this book anyway. It's coming out this year. Because she's got a prose poem called Study of Two Figures, Pasiphae and Sado. And both of the titular figures in this poem are contained. One is Greek and mythic, and the other is Korean and historical. And they both became famous for their problematic, murderous or adulterous or bestial desires, and they both ended up in containers. The male figure, Sado, waits in the container for death to come. He's been locked in a rice chest in the Korean story, while the female figure waits in the container, a mechanical cow, for the generation of a life. She's going to give birth to the Minotaur. And because Pasiphae in Greek myth comes from Colchis and Anatolia, both she and Sado are what speakers of modern American English would call Asian. And I'll read you some Monica Youn. I'm sorry I don't have a slide for this poem, but it's coming. The rice chest and the hollow cow are not the only containers in this poem. Asianness is a container in this poem. Race is a container in this poem. Each of these containers contains desire and its satisfaction. Each of these containers contains a hot button, a taboo. The tourist and the artist can enter each of these containers. The tourist and the artist can touch the hot button and walk away. Containers like the rice chest and the cow and the modern category of race do not simply set boundaries to the desires of the people they represent. They allow desires and their representations to move through the outer world safely, while the people inside who are Asian may die. And the analogy here to predominantly Asian, often Filipino, cargo ship crews, I think needs no further emphasis. But that's something else that the poem as a container can do that I want you to see as you think about the multiple utilities of the analogy that I've been offering for how poems move through the world and how the modern world gives us ways to think about what poems do. A little bit more time? Yeah. The idea that forms are repurposed containers has itself become the basis for a punning exercise in form. A few years ago, the editors of the Hamden Sydney Poetry Review asked early career poets to construct sonnets around one of 5 words: silence, water, a walk, frames, and container. Here is the start of Hannah Notes's poem Sonnet Overflow, assembled from phrases computer people use. Can I add more containers within those containers? I must be doing something wrong. Can I make the container grow? And I'll read you the beginning of another sonnet about craft, form, and containers. Cup Stacking at the School Talent Show by Maria Hummel. For every mumbled song we mothers clapped, faking joy, until that boy claimed the stage's glow, his fingers lifting, setting, slipping, slap to the table, red plastic stacks and rows. And there's nothing going on in the sport or pastime of cup stacking here except the manipulation of containers. Why would you do this? Now, is formal mastery in poetry just like cup stacking? Are we moving around empty containers? Exchange value? Shipping containers are also potentially containers for emptiness in a couple of ways. You can empty them out before you move them around, and they can represent exchange value, transported and accounted for no matter what's inside. And in this way, they shadow the critic Angela Layton's really important argument in a book called On Form. For Layton, attention to form and to the aesthetic always comes dangerously close to nihilism, since form without content, by definition, means nothing. To acknowledge the nothing at the heart of the literary, Layton speculates, is a way of starting to ask what the work knows, that is, what a container built for everything, hence for nothing, can disclose. We are not far away in this world of potentially empty formal containers from a kind of Paul de Man-ish perspective in which the forms that seem to preserve people make them inaudible, in which signs destroy what they seem to mean. But we can get out of that world if we remember that shipping containers, like words and genres and forms, can be reopened and retooled and reused. As Frank Bidart puts it, we fill pre-existing forms, and by filling them, we change them, and we are changed. And again, you can say the same thing about shipping containers. Even Craig Martin, the critic who sees in them the representative object of capitalism, considers container reuse as a way of bringing a human scale, quote, a way of making space. If you go to New Zealand, again, you'll see these containers insistently reused, made into human space. You'll also see contemporary cliches and internet language reused to create distinctive poetry in the person of Hera Lindsay Bird, the most successful young poet of New Zealand in the 20-teens. And she makes fun of herself a lot and of the Insta generation, and she makes fun of readers' demands that poetry do something absolutely new. What's the point? Maybe I can say jazz apothecary or hand panty liner. Bird's poet doesn't discover feelings or forms any more than she discovers English words. Instead, she's having fun with and making ironies out of what's already there. Going even farther than I have, Weichi Dimmock, another critic, suggests that all literary kinds are like shipping containers, traveling and changing their contents and hooking up and switching off. Stackable, switchable, and scalable, Dimmock writes. And of course, she could be describing containers. Containers can stand for what another critic, Jahan Ramazani, calls traveling poetry, whose mnemonic structure enables its influence across time and space, and its imaginative enactment of geographic movement. We can set poems as containers, and I'm almost finished, a couple more minutes. Okay, we can set poems as containers, as shipping containers, as moving containers, beside a sadder, older, and more visible analogy for lyric poems, the prison cell. Some of you know Wordsworth's somewhat strained defense of the sonnet, nuns fret not at their convent's narrow room. The modern poet Terence Hayes extrapolated on the idea that poetic forms are containers like prisons in his poem Model Prison Model. Hayes in that poem and elsewhere has in mind the real prisons in which black men are disproportionately incarcerated, the ones in which, as Hayes writes, my parents and first cousin worked decades as prison guards. But Hayes also suggests the prison or dungeon of Andrew Marvell's dialogue between the soul and the body. Poems might be prisons made of words, and language itself a prison house for the soul. And following Wordsworth but flipping his politics, the critic and poet Andrea Brady has likened the systems by which we learn to read lyric poetry to the carceral systems that confine bodies and serve the state. Ornamented bondage is still bondage, Brady concludes, and nothing but revolution, not poetry alone, will cast it off. And in this way of interpreting, which some of you have probably encountered in classes and in books, poems as we know them and poetic forms are cells and shackles and means of confinement and isolation devoted to individuals over communities, reinforcing an unjust and a white supremacist order. This is Brady again, translating compulsory bondage into a voluntary situations through the deception of received language. And Brady is taking up earlier ideas about poems, not just Wordsworth's, but John Stuart Mill's. And Mill thought that lyric poetry was the lament of a prisoner in a solitary cell, and Mill thought that was just fine, though. Not a fan of prisons, but he was a fan of poems. He didn't buy Brady's metaphor. And that prison metaphor, I think, it shows up in a lot of contemporary criticism. In Casey Finberg's summary, the prison metaphor became an idealized lyric form, and the critic or poet who's doing the right thing on this model needs to tear down the walls and spring the atomized, capitalized, confined subject into collective freedom from an individualized jail. And I think that kind of critique might be depriving poets and readers of safety or travel or home. It is one thing to write, as Brady sometimes does, about individual poets, from Thomas Wyatt to Dwayne Betts, who write from personal experience of literal incarceration. It is another to suggest that prison cells are more like lyric poems than other kinds of containment are like poems. And I have been arguing that adaptable, international, reusable, customizable, and yet still implicated shipping containers make a better analogy than the prison for the contemporary lyric poem. Containers present the culpability and the excess of modern life. They present symptoms, as poems also do, but like poems and forms, once they start traveling, they can also exemplify ingenuity, personality, shelter, resistance, if you like, and reuse. Carceral spaces are hard to repurpose, though it's been done. Shipping containers have standard outward forms by contrast and can hold and protect and make available an uncountable variety of persons and things. Once they are repurposed or reused, they become instruments of vernacular tactics over time. And I use tactics in the word sense made popular by the French theorist Michel de Certeau. Shipping containers become instruments of tactics, even if they begin their careers as part of the strategy of global capital. They can be evacuated, redecorated, translated, personalized, and remade. They may be oppressive or liberating or convenient or remote or closed or open or public or private or domestic, and very much as with modern poetry, if you don't like them, you can just leave. And I've got a little more about if there are engineering theorists in the house, but I think I'm going to stop there so we can Q&A and get up and stand up and move around. Or leap. Thank you. I hope that was worth your time. Like, you never know when you hear applause. It's like, oh, you're being polite. Or, no. Thank you. Thank you to those of you online who stuck around. And seriously, the Monica Yoon book is not about shipping containers. It's really, really good. Her name is Y-O-U-N, and this is a book called From that's coming out from Grey Wolf in like March or April or something. And you want it. It's possible that half that talk was a covert response to Monica Yoon's poetry, even though she doesn't write about shipping containers. And I'm not sure she would agree with some of the claims I've been making here. But I want to be sure that, given where we are and what I've been talking about, you pick that one up. and also read poetry from New Zealand. Like, people don't. It's so good. There's so much of it. It's the same size as Minnesota, honestly. It's about the same population. There's certain similarities, especially if you're here. There's an absolute like Minnesota Aotearoa connection that I would like to make. I'm talking because I'm waiting for people to ask questions. I can kind of riff on shipping containers. I can read to you from Brandon Som's new book, which I got yesterday. I don't know.
One comment then.
Yeah. Hi.
I applaud your delivery.
Thank you.
That's the most engaging. I marvel you can take any subject, and with your delivery and the combination of your readings, I'm waiting for your next presentation.
Come to the reading tonight. You know what else is really good at delivery, by the way? Shipping containers. Oh, do you want me to sit down? Okay. Hi.
Is this the page on which questions might appear? Over here. Well, we're figuring this out. Brilliant question.
I can ask a question.
Yeah, hi. Hi.
I'm Elaine Oyeon.
Oh, hi. I owe you an email. Thank you for emailing me yesterday. It was great. I stayed with all the grad students and didn't need the thing you offered, but I'm really glad that you're here. Thank you.
So I love, like, that gentleman. I also just adored this presentation, and I adore your work, your other writing. And I think one thread that I've been tracing through all of your work and in today's talk is just how capacious and flexible your just way of seeing is. And I think it almost feels like the critique of other ways of thinking about shipping containers is a kind of implicit critique of a certain kind of rigidity in
Oh, yeah, it is. Yeah.
academic thinking about what poetry can be or what you're allowed to say about poems or experience in poetry. And I just would love to maybe invite you to make your tacit critique more more explicit about just the way that shipping containers they are rigid, so it really can invite you to think about them in rigid ways, but then in the way that you've attended to poets who are looking at it in these really flexible and imaginative ways show that that's not true.
Yeah, I mean, the poems can do all sorts of things once you figure out how to open them up, and you realize that they don't have to be forever part of the system that brought them to you, which is an unjust system, right? The fact that all of us are here in this room and that we are communicating in English is, and for different people in different ways, but for all of us who are communicating in English in Minnesota in some degree, a consequence of centuries of unspeakable horrors and of world systems that continue to operate. And some people who are in literary studies want to use literary studies principally to point out that those unspeakable horrors are around and still affect us. And that is a worthy use of the tools given us by literary studies, and a worthy use of the tools that we have to talk about the history of poetry, but it's not the only use. And I don't want anyone to think it's the only use any more than I want people to think that all poems do the same thing. They don't. And any poetic form and any way of writing that is small and stackable can be repurposed once the right writer comes along. And I like this metaphor because it brings home that aspect of the set of forms we call lyric. You could say this in some ways about songs and song forms, although that's a larger conversation. I don't think you could say it about like the triple-decker novel or the well-made play, because they're too big and they're more culturally specific and they're more nailed to the floor where they come from. But poems, I mean, the tools that we have that we label as lyric are super adaptable, and the individual forms that we associate with lyric are super adaptable. And one of the reasons we know that is that, like the eye, the lyric has evolved independently in multiple cultures and language groups. You can't sort of prove it, just like you can't, prove that an apple in my hand is the same kind of thing as like an apple in South Carolina, but you can see forms that appear to express strong feeling and interiority emerge in cultures that develop writing independently. And I have colleagues who've written about how this happens in ancient freaking Egypt. It certainly happens in classical China. It happens in a different way that I know less about in Korean, but again, it evolved out of song forms, and the forms get changed so that they're written down, and you have lyric poetry in some sense. So how did we get here? The lyric poem is not simply an instrument of dominance, and I'm fatigued and dispirited by my colleagues who insist that it is, even though it can also be that. And I feel like I've spent a lot of my professional life saying, no, but it does other things too. This thing keeps being read for pleasure by real people and keeps being used by subsequent generation because it can do other things too. If I were a bit older than I am, I probably would have grown up in a literary space where it was very important to me to yell about the presence of patriarchy and the presence of the terrible things that capital does to us. And because I'm the age that I am and not younger or older, I grew up when that's what lots of people were yelling about already, and I find myself moved instead to say, no, this also does other things. Is that responsive at all? Okay, thanks. I'm sorry I went on a bit. I'm hoping I'm not just riffing. Hi.
Steph, we have a question from Dobby Gibson.
Dobby Gibson.
Wonderful poet.
Dobby Gibson, I hope you can make it tonight, but it's okay if you can't. You're a wonderful poet. Everyone should read Dobby Gibson's poetry.
Okay, well,
Some of you already do, I hope. Hi, Dobby Gibson.
I read Dobby's poetry, and now I get to read Dobby's question.
Hi.
Steph, hello. That's not a question.
You're a really good writer.
Your talk made me think of the terrific Terence Hayes book and poem Wind in a Box.
Yep.
Curious whether you thought of that too, and if so, how it figured into your thinking.
There are about 5 pages from this talk that got written and cut that are about Terence Hayes. And I should probably mention the title of Wind in a Box, which is a great book, which I don't in this version. I just talk about the prison stuff. But Hayes, everything that Hayes has written since his first book, which is good but not quite as self-conscious, almost all of Hayes's, they're all good books, almost all of Hayes's books have stunningly subtle and multi-sided reflections on what lyric and voice and persona are and do. And if for some reason anyone wanted me to talk on the subject for 4 hours, there would be 45 minutes on Terence Hayes. Also, you'd all leave. You don't want that. But you're completely right. And I mean, there's more on this stuff in How to Be Drawn as well, where the poem How to Draw a Perfect Circle, where like what's inside the circle, what is a boundary, does lyric make a boundary, does violence destroy a boundary? I think there was a quote from his poem about moving to New York, the one that ends everybody listening to Grace Jones and everybody jonesing for Grace, where they stand on top of a building that has a party going on inside it. There's just a lot of Terence Hayes in my brain. Hi.
Hi, thank you so slightly different ear, and I hope I'm not directing the conversation in a direction that you're not interested in. But your talk really resonated with me because my work is on refugees from Nazi Germany, and a lot of these people, when they were fleeing their homeland, they basically were packing their stuff into mini containers that they called lifts, and these lifts became really important cultural artifacts that sort of accompany this mass displacement. And some of them repurposed them as homes and shelters and all sorts of stuff like that. But in my work, when I read their sources, I find all sorts of like little bits and pieces about what these lifts meant to them in their lives. And how you ended the talk with, you know, how there could be so many different meanings to these containers. I really see that in how, in the different relationships that these people then developed with these lifts. For some people, that, you know, they took whatever they could have from their lives in these things. For other people, it was, they were lost when the ships were bombed during the war, or I even have like a few poems that people actually did write about their lifts, and they developed all these different relationships to them. They were economic means of survival because they contained everything that they could take from their homes. And so there are all of these different levels and layers of relationships that people built to these containers that became kind of analogous of their own life and displacement. So yeah, not so much a question, but I just wanted to put that out there too.
That's great, thank you. Also, I forgot to thank our ASL translator. Thank you. Simultaneous translation is really hard. And I'm honored that you're devoting these resources. Yeah, I don't know how that's a question, it's just great, thank you. We can talk about poetry and refugees and the poetry of refugees and poetry about refugees and how to look at that material when you're not a refugee. Adrian Rich comes to mind. Or we can talk about the valises and carrying cases and like what becomes part of your person and what can you carry on your back. Trope, which I think you see in other refugee flows, but I didn't know about the lifts or people living in the lifts. You know, are these poems well known? Are they in English or Yiddish or German or?
Most of the stuff that I know of is in German, but it's not published. It's things that people, you know, sort of poetry that they write to, you know, recite for someone's birthday or things like that. Sort of Gelegenheit poetry is what it's called in German, like events poetry.
Yeah.
Things like
Occasional
that.
poems is what you say in English.
Yeah.
Is the YIVO Institute involved in this stuff?
More the Leo Beck Institute, and if you're interested, I can approach you after we're done, and we can continue this conversation.
Okay, so A, of course, who wouldn't be interested? B, if you email me, then I can like share the information easily, not just with like the inside of my own head, because this is cool to learn about, but with my father, who like is delighted whenever he learns that anything that I'm working on has any relation to Jewish history. So yeah, can you email it? Thank you. Yeah.
I'm getting a message here, Steph, that says that should be the last question. And
wait, there's an audience. One more?
Dan, you're being cut. What? No, of course, Dan.
It's a quick one. Thanks. I was wondering about the directionality of your metaphor, in that there's a relationship you're drawing between textuality and materiality, which is using the material to talk about poetics.
Yeah.
But I was wondering about your thoughts about poetics as a metaphor for material changes. There's an architect in New Jersey named Adam Kalkin who says of shipping containers, I was always interested in the poetry of them.
Oh yeah, he's quoted in the longer version, yeah.
Okay, so can you talk a little bit about, do you find that the metaphor of poetics is useful and appropriate for the repurposing of these containers, or is the metaphor much more valid from the material side to the poetic side?
I mean, poetics is about putting things together and assembling structures that have components beyond their direct functionality or you know, meanings. So yeah, like you can use the terms drawn from poetry and poetics to talk about making any part of the built environment. You can use it to talk about making bridges. You can use it to talk about, decorating kitchens. So yeah, of course. I don't, I'm not an architect or an architecture theorist. I'm a poetry critic, I think. So I find myself having more to say about how poetry readers and poetry critics can learn from the reuse of shipping containers rather than like what architects, engineers, and designers learn from poems, but I hope it goes both ways. And I also just want to mention engineers, because one of the things, and I feel like this might be a Peter Campion thing to say, one of the things you learn when you hang out with engineers and engineering teachers, which I do sometimes, is how much architects depend on engineers to build buildings that won't fall down. And the analogy to that in poetry and poetics, I think, has to do with acquiring an ear and a sense of history and a sense of audience, and being able to make structures that will work, that will circulate in the world and not be forgotten. I don't want to take that, one could take that in conservative directions that I would never agree with. And that's, no. But I do want us to remember, and this is a difference between architecture and design on the one hand and poetry and poetics on the other. Architecture is like literary criticism in that it is an applied art. You are doing something that should be cool, but you're also doing it to serve someone else and to do a practical purpose. It doesn't matter how good a house is as a design thing if it's unpleasant or painful to live in, or if it won't keep out the rain in a rainy climate. And it doesn't matter for me how elegant a piece of poetry criticism is, or how fine a display of the critic's sensibility it is, if it's not responsive to the thing that you're writing about. So in that sense, architects and literary critics are perhaps more like each other than either are like poets. But that doesn't mean architects can't use the terms of poetics. They can, and they do, and they should. And yeah, thanks. Do we have to stop?
Well, we have
I'm having fun.
and we have your books for sale, so we can all.
Oh yeah, no. Let's please buy my books and I'll sign them. Thank you for coming.